May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The Third Reich collapses. But for millions of German soldiers, the war's end was not liberation. It was the beginning of an ordeal that would stretch across years, continents, and in some cases, entire lifetimes. Over 5 million German soldiers found themselves prisoners of war. What followed was a story of survival, desperation, and political manipulation that reshaped post-war Europe. Some would return home within months. Others would vanish into the Soviet wilderness for over a decade, and thousands would never return at all. The fate of these men became a bargaining chip in the emerging Cold War, their lives determined by the nation that captured them. Today, we uncover the untold story of what really happened to Germany's defeated army. The collapse of Nazi Germany created an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Wehrmacht units were scattered across Europe, from Norway to Italy, from France to the Eastern Front. As communication broke down and command structures disintegrated, individual units faced an impossible choice: fight to the death or surrender to an uncertain fate. The scale of the surrender was staggering. Entire army groups, some numbering in the hundreds of thousands, laid down their weapons within days of each other. The 21st Army Group surrendered in northern Germany with over 500,000 men. Army Group South, retreating through Austria, surrendered with another 600,000 soldiers. These were not small tactical units. These were massive military formations that had conquered much of Europe, now reduced to columns of defeated men. The Western Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners. In the final weeks of the war, German units raced westward, desperate to surrender to anyone other than the Soviets. They had heard the stories from the Eastern Front. They knew what awaited them in Russian hands. Entire divisions abandoned their positions facing the Red Army and marched hundreds of miles westward, hoping to reach Allied lines before Soviet forces could intercept them. The scenes of surrender were chaotic and often surreal. German officers who had commanded divisions and corps found themselves standing in muddy fields, stripped of their insignia, waiting to learn their fate from enemy soldiers, often decades younger than themselves. Some units maintained military discipline even in defeat, marching into captivity in formation. Others simply dissolved, with individual soldiers discarding weapons and uniforms, hoping to blend into the civilian population. General Eisenhower's forces suddenly had to manage over 2 million German prisoners along the Rhine. Temporary camps sprouted overnight in muddy fields, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. These were not permanent facilities. They were holding pens for a problem no one had fully anticipated. The logistical challenge was immense: housing, feeding, and guarding more prisoners than many entire armies contained. The conditions were harsh by necessity. Food was scarce across war-torn Europe, and feeding captured German soldiers was not a priority when Allied nations struggled to feed their own populations. Men who had marched across continents now found themselves sleeping in muddy enclosures, subsisting on minimal rations, wondering if they would live to see their families again. Many had not eaten a proper meal in weeks even before their capture, as German supply lines had collapsed in the final months of the war. But this was only the beginning. The real test would come when these prisoners were divided among the victorious powers, each with their own plans for Germany's defeated warriors. The prisoners captured by Western forces initially faced better prospects than their counterparts in the East, but survival was far from guaranteed. The Americans and British established vast prisoner-of-war camps across Germany and France, housing hundreds of thousands of men in conditions that ranged from adequate to deplorable. The most notorious of these facilities were the Rhine Meadow camps, where American forces housed German prisoners in open fields with minimal shelter. These camps, designated as prisoner-of-war enclosures rather than proper POW camps, operated under different international law protections. Men slept in holes they dug themselves, covered by scraps of canvas or metal sheeting. The distinction in terminology was not merely bureaucratic. It allowed Allied forces to provide fewer resources and protections than traditional POW camps required. The camps stretched along the Rhine River for miles, each housing tens of thousands of prisoners in conditions that shocked even hardened military personnel. Prisoners were provided with minimal tools to construct their own shelters, leading to the creation of vast underground communities. Some men became expert at constructing elaborate dugouts that provided protection from the elements, while others lived in conditions barely better than open-air detention. Disease spread rapidly in these overcrowded conditions. Dysentery, pneumonia, and malnutrition claimed thousands of lives in the months following Germany's surrender. Medical care was limited, and many prisoners weakened by years of war found themselves unable to survive the harsh conditions of captivity. Allied medical officers, already overwhelmed by caring for their own wounded, had few resources to dedicate to enemy prisoners. The food situation was particularly dire. Daily rations often consisted of a few hundred calories, far below what was needed to maintain health, especially for men engaged in physical labor. Prisoners learned to eat grass, roots, and anything else that might provide nutrition. Those with previous experience of hunger, often from the Eastern Front, were better equipped to survive than soldiers who had served in more comfortable theaters. Yet even in these dire circumstances, some prisoners discovered unexpected opportunities. Those with valuable skills, engineers, technicians, scientists, found themselves recruited for reconstruction efforts. The Allies needed expertise to rebuild Europe's shattered infrastructure, and German know-how was too valuable to waste. These men often found themselves moved to better facilities and provided with improved rations in exchange for their cooperation. The denazification process began in earnest during this period. Every prisoner underwent extensive interrogation and classification. The questionnaires were detailed and intrusive, covering not just military service but political beliefs, family connections, and personal history. Former SS members faced the harshest treatment and longest imprisonment. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers who could prove they had not committed war crimes might be released within a year or two, but proving innocence in a system designed to assume guilt was not always straightforward. The classification system created a complex hierarchy within the camps. Those deemed white were considered politically clean and faced the shortest sentences. Gray prisoners required further investigation and faced longer detention. Black prisoners, those considered ardent Nazis or war criminals, faced indefinite imprisonment and possible trial. The irony was not lost on many prisoners that they were being judged by the same criteria they had once used to categorize others. The psychological impact of captivity extended far beyond physical hardship. These men had served what they believed was their country, and now found themselves branded as criminals by association. The shame of defeat, mixed with uncertainty about their family's fate, created a mental toll that would follow many prisoners for the rest of their lives. Letters from home, when permitted, often brought news of destruction, death, and displacement that added to their psychological burden. As 1946 progressed, the Western Allies began releasing prisoners in larger numbers, but the process remained slow and bureaucratic. The lucky ones returned to families and communities that had survived the war. Others discovered their homes destroyed, their families scattered or dead, their entire world transformed beyond recognition. The 2 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces faced an entirely different fate, one that would become synonymous with suffering and death on an unprecedented scale. Stalin had no intention of quickly releasing these prisoners. They represented both revenge for the devastation of the Soviet Union and a massive source of free labor for reconstruction. The initial transport eastward was itself a death sentence for many. Soviet forces packed prisoners into cattle cars with no regard for basic human needs. Cars designed to hold 40 men often contained twice that number. There was no sanitation, minimal ventilation, and no regular provision of food or water. The journey to distant camps could take weeks, during which prisoners weakened by combat and starvation often died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them. Those who survived the journey discovered a systematic approach to prisoner exploitation that dwarfed anything they had experienced in Western camps. The Soviet Union had perfected the use of forced labor through decades of operating the Gulag system, and German prisoners were simply fed into this existing machinery of oppression. Soviet treatment of German prisoners violated virtually every provision of the Geneva Convention, though the USSR had never signed the agreement. Prisoners were immediately shipped eastward in cattle cars, packed so tightly that many died during transport. Those who survived the journey found themselves in a network of labor camps, stretching from the Arctic Circle to Central Asia. The camps themselves were designed for maximum exploitation of human labor. Prisoners worked in coal mines, uranium mines, construction projects, and logging operations across the vast Soviet territory. The work was dangerous, the equipment primitive, and safety precautions non-existent. Men who had survived the mechanized warfare of the 20th century found themselves reduced to human pack animals, hauling materials by hand across frozen landscapes. The mortality rate in Soviet camps was catastrophic. Conservative estimates suggest that 400,000 German prisoners died in Soviet captivity, though the true number may never be known. Starvation, exhaustion, disease, and brutal working conditions claimed lives daily. The Soviet system operated on the principle that human life was expendable. There were always more prisoners to replace those who died. Winter conditions in the camps were particularly lethal. Prisoners often lacked adequate clothing for temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite was common, and many men lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs to the cold. Those who could no longer work effectively were often left to die, as medical care was reserved for prisoners who could still contribute to production quotas. The food situation was deliberately used as a tool of control. Rations were tied to work performance, creating a vicious cycle where weakened prisoners could not meet quotas, received reduced food, and became even weaker. The daily ration for a prisoner meeting his quota might provide 1,500 calories, barely enough to sustain life. Those who failed to meet quotas received even less. Prisoners were forced to work in mines, forests, and construction projects, often with minimal food and inadequate clothing for the harsh Russian winter. The construction of the Baikal-Amur Railway, massive hydroelectric projects, and mining operations across Siberia all relied heavily on German prisoner labor. These projects were designed to showcase Soviet industrial might, but they were built on a foundation of human suffering. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical conditions. Soviet authorities systematically attempted to break down prisoners' mental resistance through re-education programs. Men were forced to attend political lectures, write self-criticisms, and denounce their former beliefs. Those who resisted faced punishment that could include solitary confinement or reduced rations that meant slow starvation. The re-education process was designed to create not just compliance but genuine conversion to Soviet ideology. Prisoners were required to write detailed autobiographies confessing their crimes against the Soviet people and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to redeem themselves through labor. Those who showed proper political development might be granted minor privileges or slightly better treatment. Communication with families was severely restricted or completely forbidden. Many German families spent years not knowing whether their sons, fathers, and husbands were alive or dead. The uncertainty became a form of torture for both prisoners and their loved ones back home. Some prisoners attempted escape, though success was virtually impossible given the vast distances and harsh terrain of the Soviet Union. Those caught faced execution or transfer to even more brutal camps. The few who succeeded in reaching friendly territory brought back horrifying accounts that confirmed the worst fears about Soviet treatment of prisoners. The psychological impact of this treatment extended far beyond the camps themselves. Survivors who eventually returned to Germany often suffered from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were poorly understood at the time. Many never fully recovered from their experiences, carrying the trauma of Soviet captivity for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most cruel aspect of Soviet captivity was its duration. While Western prisoners were typically released within 2 to 3 years, Soviet prisoners faced an indefinite sentence that could stretch across decades. As the Cold War intensified, German prisoners in Soviet hands became political pawns in a larger geopolitical game. Stalin used their continued imprisonment as leverage against the West, while their suffering became a rallying cry for the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviet Union had initially promised to repatriate all prisoners within 2 years of the war's end, but as 1947 passed into 1948, it became clear that many prisoners would remain in captivity indefinitely. The reasons were both ideological and practical. The Soviet Union needed their labor, and their continued imprisonment served as a form of ongoing punishment for German aggression. By 1950, when most Western prisoners had returned home, an estimated 85,000 German soldiers remained in Soviet camps. These men had survived the initial wave of deaths, but faced the psychological torment of seemingly endless captivity. Many had been classified as war criminals based on minimal evidence or simply their unit's location during the war. The classification process was arbitrary and often depended more on the need for workers in particular regions than on actual evidence of wrongdoing. The camps where these long-term prisoners were held had evolved into self-contained communities with their own hierarchies, economies, and social structures. Prisoners developed elaborate bartering systems, trading food for cigarettes, repairs for protection, or skilled labor for better sleeping positions. Those with useful skills, carpenters, mechanics, doctors, occupied privileged positions within the prisoner hierarchy. The daily routine in these camps was designed to break both body and spirit. Prisoners woke before dawn, worked 12-hour shifts in mines or construction projects, attended mandatory political education sessions, and survived on rations that provided barely enough calories to sustain life. Medical care was primitive, and minor injuries or illnesses often became death sentences. A simple cut could become infected, leading to gangrene and death. Broken bones often healed improperly, leaving men permanently disabled. The work itself was deliberately punishing. Prisoners might spend years digging canals by hand, hauling rocks for construction projects, or working in mines where cave-ins and gas explosions were common. The tools were often primitive, and safety equipment was non-existent. Production quotas were set at levels that required maximum effort, leaving prisoners exhausted and vulnerable to injury. Letters from home, when permitted, brought both comfort and anguish. Prisoners learned of children who had grown up without them, wives who had been forced to remarry for survival, and parents who had died waiting for their return. Some received news that their families had fled to the West, making any future reunion uncertain, even if they ever gained freedom. The psychological impact of these letters was often devastating, as men realized that the world they had known no longer existed. Communication was heavily censored, and many letters never reached their intended recipients. Prisoners learned to write in code, hiding real messages within approved political statements. Families back home developed similar techniques, embedding personal information within discussions of approved topics. This hidden communication became a lifeline for many prisoners, providing hope that they had not been forgotten. The classification system in Soviet camps created a hierarchy of suffering. Former officers faced harsher treatment than enlisted men. Those accused of war crimes, often based on their unit's actions rather than individual behavior, were sent to the most brutal camps in Siberia and the Arctic. Some prisoners spent years in solitary confinement for infractions as minor as speaking German instead of Russian. The punishment cells were often unheated concrete boxes where men slowly froze to death during the brutal Russian winters. Religious faith became both a source of strength and danger. Secret prayer services provided comfort, but discovery by guards could result in severe punishment. Some prisoners found strength in their beliefs, while others lost faith entirely in the face of such prolonged suffering. The gradual release of prisoners began only after Stalin's death in 1953. But even then, the process remained painfully slow. Soviet authorities used prisoner releases as diplomatic tools, timing announcements to coincide with international negotiations or domestic political needs. The psychological condition of long-term prisoners deteriorated dramatically over time. Men who had endured 5, 7, or even 10 years of captivity often struggled to maintain their sanity. Some developed severe mental illness, while others simply withdrew into themselves, becoming shells of their former selves. The plight of German prisoners became a central issue in post-war German politics and international relations. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer made their release a cornerstone of his foreign policy, understanding that no German government could legitimately claim to represent the nation while thousands of its citizens remained enslaved in Soviet camps. The negotiations were complex and often frustrating. Soviet authorities insisted that all remaining prisoners were war criminals who deserved their fate, while German officials argued that many were being held unjustly. The truth, as often happens in such situations, lay somewhere between these positions. Behind the diplomatic language lay human tragedy on an enormous scale. Families had reorganized their lives around the assumption that their loved ones were never coming home. Children had grown up with only photographs of fathers they barely remembered. Women had faced impossible choices between waiting indefinitely and moving on with their lives. The Soviet Union used prisoner releases as a tool of foreign policy, offering freedom in exchange for diplomatic recognition, trade agreements, or other concessions. Each negotiation was a chess game played with human lives as pieces, and the psychological toll on both prisoners and families continued to mount with each failed round of talks. German public opinion became increasingly focused on the prisoner issue as the 1950s progressed. Families organized advocacy groups, churches held prayer services, and politicians faced pressure to secure their citizens' freedom. The prisoners became symbols of German suffering and Soviet cruelty, playing an important role in shaping West German attitudes toward the East. The breakthrough came in 1955 when Adenauer traveled to Moscow to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. The negotiations were tense and sometimes bitter, with both sides making demands that seemed impossible to fulfill. But finally, an agreement was reached that would bring the long nightmare to an end. September 1955 marked the beginning of the final chapter in this saga of suffering and survival. The physical condition of the returnees shocked even those prepared for the worst. Men in their 30s and 40s looked elderly, marked by malnutrition, hard labor, and psychological trauma. Many required immediate medical attention, and some never fully recovered their health. The psychological adjustment proved even more challenging than the physical recovery. These men had survived by developing mental strategies that served them well in Soviet camps, but were counterproductive in normal society. They had learned to trust no one, to hide their thoughts, and to expect betrayal. Learning to live as free men again required enormous effort and often professional help. German society struggled to integrate these returnees. While they were welcomed as heroes who had suffered for their country, their experiences were so extreme that many civilians found them difficult to understand or relate to. Some returnees felt more comfortable with other former prisoners than with their own families. The stories they brought back confirmed the worst fears about Soviet treatment of prisoners and contributed to the hardening of Cold War attitudes. Their testimony provided crucial evidence about conditions in Soviet labor camps and helped shape Western understanding of Stalin's system. But for all the trauma and difficulty, the return of the last prisoners represented a form of closure for Germany. A chapter that had begun with military defeat was finally ending, allowing the nation to move forward without the burden of knowing that thousands of its citizens remained enslaved. The true measure of this tragedy cannot be captured in statistics alone, though the numbers are staggering. Of the approximately 5 million German soldiers taken prisoner at the end of World War II, roughly 1 million never returned home. They died in camps, during transport, or from diseases contracted in captivity. Those who did survive carried invisible wounds that affected not just themselves, but their families and communities for generations. Many returnees struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and survivor's guilt. The skills that had kept them alive in captivity, emotional numbness, hypervigilance, and social withdrawal, often made normal relationships impossible. Families bore their own scars from the experience. Children who had grown up without fathers often found it difficult to relate to men who had become strangers. Wives who had maintained households alone for years sometimes struggled to readjust to married life. The economic impact was also severe, as many families had lived in poverty during the breadwinner's absence. The wider German society was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility and guilt. While these men had served in Hitler's army, many had been ordinary soldiers rather than committed Nazis. Their suffering in captivity complicated simple narratives about German guilt and Allied justice. The experience of captivity also created lasting bonds among survivors that often proved stronger than family relationships. Former prisoners organized reunion groups and mutual aid societies that continued for decades. They understood each other in ways that even their closest family members could not. Medical professionals gradually recognized that the effects of prolonged captivity extended far beyond immediate physical trauma. The term late damage entered German medical vocabulary to describe health problems that emerged years or even decades after liberation. Heart disease, kidney problems, and neurological disorders appeared with unusual frequency among former prisoners. The impact on German culture was profound but often subtle. Literature, film, and art began to explore themes of captivity, survival, and return that reflected this collective trauma. The experience became part of the national memory, influencing attitudes toward war, justice, and international relations. Today, as we witness new conflicts around the world, the lessons from this period remain relevant. The protection of prisoners of war is not just a legal obligation, but a moral imperative that reflects our commitment to human dignity, even in the midst of war. The men who survived years of captivity demonstrated remarkable resilience and the capacity of the human spirit to endure almost unimaginable hardship. Their story is one of suffering, but also of survival, hope, and the eventual triumph of the human will to live and return home. Their legacy reminds us that behind every historical statistic are individual human beings with names, families, dreams, and fears. The 5 million German soldiers who became prisoners were not abstract figures, but fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands whose fate affected countless others. The final prisoner releases in 1955 marked the end of one of the longest prisoner of war crises in history. But the impact of those years of captivity continued to shape lives and families for decades to come. Understanding their story helps us comprehend not just what happened after World War II, but what war truly costs in human terms. And while the fate of German soldiers was terrifying, little is said about how they became pawns of the Nazi regime, how they lived, and how they orchestrated countless war crimes. Hans Müller was typical of many young German men who found themselves in Wehrmacht uniforms. Born in 1925 in a small Bavarian village, Hans spent his childhood like any other boy, playing football, attending school, and helping his father in their small bakery. His mother sang him lullabies, his teachers praised his mathematics skills, and his greatest worry was whether the local football team would win their regional championship. But by 1942, everything changed. The Nazi Party had been reshaping German youth for over a decade through the Hitler Youth Organization. Hans, like millions of others, had been a member since age 10. What began as camping trips and group activities gradually evolved into military-style training and political indoctrination. The organization provided structure, adventure, and belonging that many young people craved, especially during the economic uncertainty of the early 1930s. Hans's transformation didn't happen overnight. At age 10, Hitler Youth meetings felt like an extension of Boy Scouts, hiking, camping, learning outdoor skills. But by age 14, the activities had shifted dramatically. Military drills replaced nature walks. Political lectures replaced campfire stories. Competition between groups intensified, with winners receiving recognition and privileges while losers faced public shame. The process wasn't immediate or obvious. It happened through small steps, learning to march in formation, memorizing party slogans, participating in group rituals that emphasized loyalty to the state above all else. Hans learned to report classmates who expressed doubts about Nazi policies. He participated in book burnings and rallies without fully understanding their significance. The line between normal adolescent activities and political indoctrination became increasingly blurred. Former Hitler Youth members later described how natural it felt to transition from youth organization to military service. The uniforms were different, but the mindset had been carefully cultivated for years. They had already learned to follow orders without question, to suppress individual desires for the greater good of the group, and to view certain populations as enemies of the German people. Hans's family noticed changes in his behavior long before conscription. He became distant from his parents, critical of their traditional Catholic beliefs, and increasingly obsessed with Nazi racial theories. Dinner conversations turned into political arguments, with Hans parroting slogans he'd learned at youth meetings. His parents felt they were losing their son to something they didn't fully understand. By 1942, when Hans received his conscription notice, the transformation was already well underway. His first letter home from basic training described the brutal physical conditioning, morning runs before dawn, endless drilling, and punishments for the smallest infractions. But what's more revealing is what he didn't write about: the ideological training that accompanied every aspect of military preparation. The military would complete what the Hitler Youth had started, turning a baker's son from Bavaria into something his parents would barely recognize. But the real shock came when these young soldiers encountered the reality of war, and we'll explore just how devastating that transition could be. Wehrmacht basic training lasted approximately 16 weeks and was designed to break down individual identity while building absolute obedience. Recruits were awakened at 4:30 a.m. every day, regardless of weather conditions. The first hour was spent in physical conditioning, running, calisthenics, and obstacle courses that pushed many beyond their physical limits. Franz Becker, conscripted in 1944 at age 18, later recalled the systematic nature of the training process. Days began with political instruction before breakfast. Recruits sat in formation while officers delivered lectures about German racial superiority. the threat of Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and their duty to protect the fatherland from contamination. These sessions weren't optional discussions, they were mandatory indoctrination designed to reshape how young men viewed the world. The daily schedule was relentless and deliberately exhausting. After political instruction came breakfast, usually thin soup and black bread. Then began 8 hours of military training broken only by brief meal breaks. Recruits learned weapons handling, marching formations, combat tactics, and military protocol. But every lesson was infused with ideological content. Learning to clean a rifle became a lesson about the superiority of German engineering. Physical fitness training included chants about German superiority and the weakness of enemy races. Even medical instruction emphasized the importance of maintaining racial purity and avoiding contamination from inferior populations. The training deliberately isolated soldiers from outside influences. Mail was censored, leave was rare, and conversations were monitored. Recruits who questioned orders or expressed doubts faced immediate punishment. Extra duties, reduced rations, or public humiliation in front of their comrades. Franz described watching fellow recruits forced to stand at attention for hours in freezing weather because they had questioned an officer's political lecture. What made this system particularly effective was how it mixed legitimate military training with ideological programming. Recruits genuinely needed to learn combat skills and military discipline to survive in war, but the Nazi system ensured that every practical lesson reinforced political indoctrination. Young men couldn't learn to be soldiers without also learning to be Nazis. The psychological pressure was immense. Many recruits came from families already suffering under wartime rationing and Allied bombing campaigns. The military offered steady meals, warm clothes, and a sense of purpose, but at a terrible cost. Former soldiers described feeling grateful for the structure and security, even as they were being transformed into instruments of the Nazi state. Training also included systematic desensitization to violence through increasingly brutal exercises. Recruits practiced bayonet techniques on straw dummies while shouting racial slurs. They watched propaganda films showing enemy atrocities while being told that similar brutality awaited German civilians if they failed in their duty. Officers emphasized that traditional moral considerations didn't apply when fighting racial enemies. Franz remembered one particularly disturbing exercise, where recruits were shown photographs of executed partisans and told to discuss appropriate interrogation techniques. The session was presented as practical military training, but its real purpose was to normalize brutality and eliminate moral qualms about violence against enemies. The transformation was gradual but comprehensive. Young men who entered training as ordinary civilians emerged 16 weeks later as indoctrinated soldiers ready to implement Nazi policies without question. The process was so effective that most recruits didn't realize how dramatically they had changed. By graduation, most young men had been fundamentally changed, but nothing could truly prepare them for what awaited on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was where Nazi ideology met brutal reality. For soldiers like Klaus Hartmann, deployed to Army Group Center in late 1941, the experience was unlike anything their training had suggested. Hartmann arrived in Russia during the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa, when German forces were advancing rapidly toward Moscow. At 20 years old, he had volunteered for military service after completing his apprenticeship as a carpenter in Dresden. His unit was part of the 6th Army, and his first weeks seemed to confirm everything he'd been told about German superiority. Soviet forces appeared to be collapsing. Prisoners were captured by the thousands, and victory seemed inevitable. The initial advance felt like a triumphant parade. German columns moved through Russian countryside with minimal resistance, capturing entire Soviet units that seemed demoralized and poorly equipped. Hartmann wrote enthusiastically to his fiancée about the weak opposition and predicted he would be home for Christmas. The propaganda seemed to be proving itself correct, but winter changed everything. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and German forces found themselves completely unprepared. Soldiers wrapped newspaper around their feet because proper winter boots hadn't been supplied. Weapons froze and became useless. Vehicle engines cracked in the cold, leaving entire units stranded without transportation or supplies. Hartmann's letters home, discovered decades later in his family's attic, paint a grim picture of that first winter. He described soldiers burning books and furniture from abandoned houses just to stay warm. Food became scarce. The planned 3-week campaign had stretched into months, and supply lines couldn't keep up with advancing forces now stuck in winter positions. Men ate boiled leather and tree bark when rations ran out. Cases of frostbite became epidemic, with some soldiers losing fingers and toes, others freezing to death at their posts. Medical supplies were non-existent, and wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable under normal conditions. The psychological toll was equally devastating. The propaganda had portrayed Soviet soldiers as inferior, but Russian forces fought with desperate ferocity. German casualties mounted steadily, and units that had started with full strength were reduced to a fraction of their original size. Hartmann described watching his company shrink from 120 men to fewer than 30 over the course of 6 months. Worse still was the nature of the conflict itself. The Eastern Front wasn't just military combat, it was racial war, as Nazi ideology had defined it. German soldiers witnessed and participated in actions against civilian populations that went far beyond traditional warfare. Orders came down from high command that traditional rules of war didn't apply in the East. Prisoners were not to be taken in many circumstances. Civilian resistance was to be met with collective punishment, and entire villages were sometimes destroyed as examples to others. Hartmann struggled with what he witnessed and was ordered to participate in. His letters reveal growing confusion and moral conflict as the gap between his pre-war values and wartime reality became impossible to ignore. He wrote about difficult duties and necessary measures without providing details, but the psychological strain was evident in his increasingly erratic handwriting and disjointed thoughts. Many soldiers in Hartmann's situation developed coping mechanisms to deal with the cognitive dissonance. Some requested transfers or found ways to avoid direct participation in atrocities. Others became hardened to brutality through repeated exposure, gradually losing their capacity for moral judgment. A few embraced the ideology completely and became willing participants in the most extreme actions. The transformation of these young men continued under the extreme conditions of the Eastern Front, but the most disturbing changes were yet to come. What's most chilling about Nazi soldiers' experiences isn't the dramatic moments of violence, but the gradual normalization of brutality. Documents and testimonies reveal how ordinary men slowly adapted to extraordinary circumstances through a series of small compromises that eventually led them far from their original moral foundations. Take the case of Wilhelm Brandt, a teacher from Hamburg who was conscripted in 1942. His pre-war life was unremarkable. He taught mathematics at a local gymnasium, played chess on weekends, and enjoyed hiking in the Bavarian countryside with his wife. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, like many civil servants, but primarily for career advancement rather than ideological conviction. His students remembered him as kind and patient, someone who stayed late to help struggling pupils understand complex equations. Brandt's transformation began during his deployment to occupied Poland in late 1942. His early letters home focused on military routine, complaints about food, and requests for packages from home. He wrote about the efficiency of German administration and how they were bringing order to a chaotic region. These early observations seemed innocent enough, a teacher's natural inclination to appreciate organization and structure. But Brandt's correspondence gradually changed as he became involved in what the military termed security operations. Initially, he wrote about new policies regarding local populations, but described them in bureaucratic terms: relocations, administrative measures, security concerns. He mentioned cleansing operations and partisan suppression without explicit detail, but the context made the reality increasingly clear. The transformation accelerated through a combination of peer pressure, institutional support, and psychological conditioning. Brandt found himself assigned to units responsible for implementing racial policies in occupied territories. His mathematical skills made him valuable for logistics and planning, calculating transport capacity and resource allocation for operations he initially didn't fully understand. Over months, these euphemisms became more frequent and casual in his letters. Brandt began justifying these actions to himself and his family. They were necessary for security, he wrote, or mandated by higher authorities. He emphasized his powerlessness to change orders and his duty to follow instructions from superior officers. The process accelerated through peer pressure and institutional support. Soldiers who expressed discomfort with their assignments were isolated or transferred to more dangerous positions. Unit cohesion depended on mutual participation in increasingly extreme activities. Those who participated effectively received recognition promotion opportunities, and better assignments. The system systematically rewarded compliance while punishing moral qualms. Brandt's role evolved from observer to participant to organizer. His letters reveal how he gradually took pride in his efficiency and effectiveness at tasks he would have found unthinkable just months earlier. He wrote about solving complex logistical challenges and received commendation from superior officers for his innovative approaches to population management. The mathematics teacher who had once helped struggling students now calculated optimal methods for processing civilians through various administrative procedures. His technical skills, originally devoted to education, were redirected toward implementing Nazi racial policies with mathematical precision. By 1943, Brandt's letters described difficult but necessary work, without apparent internal conflict. He had developed elaborate justifications for his activities. They prevented chaos, protected German soldiers, and ensured efficient use of resources. The transformation from educator to implementer of Nazi policy was complete. Brandt's case wasn't unique. Military psychologists have studied how normal individuals can be gradually conditioned to participate in atrocities through incremental exposure, group pressure, and authority validation. The Nazi military system perfected these techniques, creating conditions where ordinary men could be transformed into willing participants in extraordinary brutality. But the war was turning, and these soldiers would face consequences they never anticipated. By 1943, the reality of Germany's military situation became impossible to ignore, even through the lens of propaganda. Soldiers who had experienced early victories now faced constant retreat, dwindling supplies, and mounting casualties. Otto Schwarz had enlisted voluntarily in 1940, swept up in the enthusiasm following Germany's rapid victories in France. A mechanic from Stuttgart, he believed the war would be over quickly and wanted to be part of Germany's triumph. His experience with the Afrika Korps initially seemed to confirm his optimism, but after the defeat at El Alamein and the subsequent retreat across North Africa, Schwarz found himself questioning everything he'd been told. His unit was eventually transferred to Italy, where they faced fierce resistance from Allied forces and increasingly hostile local populations. The psychological impact of constant defeat was devastating. Soldiers who had been told they were part of a master race found themselves constantly outgunned, outmaneuvered, and retreating. The cognitive dissonance between Nazi ideology and military reality created severe stress among the ranks. Schwarz's wartime diary, recovered after his capture in 1944, documents this transformation. Early entries are full of confidence and ideological conviction. Later passages reveal growing doubt, fear, and eventually desperation. He wrote about soldiers who stopped following orders, others who deliberately wounded themselves to avoid combat, and the breakdown of military discipline. The retreat also exposed soldiers to the consequences of their previous actions. As German forces withdrew from occupied territories, they encountered populations that had suffered under Nazi rule. The reception was hostile, and soldiers realized that their earlier actions had created enemies everywhere. Supply lines collapsed, leaving units stranded without adequate food, ammunition, or medical supplies. Soldiers foraged for food, abandoned wounded comrades, and in some cases turned on each other. The military hierarchy that had seemed so powerful and organized began to disintegrate. By 1944, many soldiers were fighting not for Nazi ideology or German victory, but simply for survival. They had become trapped in a system they could no longer control or escape. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, soldiers developed various psychological mechanisms to cope with their circumstances. These coping strategies reveal how human psychology adapts to extreme conditions and how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil while maintaining their sense of personal identity. Some soldiers maintained belief in Nazi ideology, even as evidence contradicted it, developing elaborate conspiracy theories to explain German defeats. Others compartmentalized their experiences, separating their wartime actions from their sense of personal identity. A few experienced complete psychological breakdown and were removed from active duty. Rudolf Hess, not the Nazi leader, but a common soldier with the same name, exemplified this psychological adaptation. Conscripted in 1943 at age 19, Hess was deployed to the Eastern Front just as German forces began their long retreat. A baker's apprentice from a small town in Saxony, he had lived a sheltered life before military service. with his greatest previous trauma being his father's death in a farming accident. Hess developed what psychologists now recognize as moral disengagement, the ability to deactivate normal ethical standards through various mental mechanisms. He rationalized participation in atrocities by focusing on orders from superior officers, emphasizing his powerlessness to change the situation, and minimizing the humanity of victims through dehumanizing language and stereotypes. The process began with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Hess initially balked at orders to search civilian homes for partisan weapons, but gradually accepted the necessity of such measures for unit security. He learned to view civilian populations not as individuals with families and fears, but as potential threats to be managed and controlled. In letters to his sister, Hess described his experiences in detached clinical terms. He wrote about processing civilians and handling security threats without acknowledging the human cost of these actions. This linguistic distancing helped him maintain psychological equilibrium while participating in activities that violated his pre-war moral framework. Hess also developed what he called his duty mindset, a psychological state where he focused exclusively on following orders and completing assigned tasks without considering broader implications. He described feeling like he was watching someone else perform these actions, as if his real self was separate from his military identity. Other soldiers in similar situations adopted different coping strategies. Some focused obsessively on military routine and discipline, finding comfort in following orders regardless of their content. The predictability of military hierarchy provided psychological stability in an increasingly chaotic situation. Many soldiers turned to alcohol when available, using intoxication to numb emotional responses to their circumstances. Others developed elaborate fantasies about post-war life that helped them endure present circumstances. These fantasies often involved returning to pre-war occupations and relationships as if nothing had changed. The most successful psychological adaptations seem to be complete compartmentalization, treating wartime actions as separate from normal moral considerations. Soldiers who mastered this technique could participate in atrocities during the day and write loving letters to their families at night without apparent internal conflict. Hess became expert at this compartmentalization. His letters home were filled with nostalgic memories of family celebrations, plans for his sister's wedding, and concern for his mother's health. These letters contained no hint of his military activities or the psychological toll of his service. He had successfully created two separate identities that rarely intersected. The psychological toll of this adaptation was severe, though often hidden. Medical records from the period show high rates of nervous disorders, sleep disturbances, and other stress-related conditions among German soldiers. Many developed symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the time were dismissed as weakness or cowardice. These psychological mechanisms allowed ordinary men to function within an extraordinary system of violence, but they came at a tremendous personal cost that would become apparent only after the war ended. The last months of the war revealed the complete breakdown of the Nazi military system and the soldiers trapped within it. By early 1945, German forces were retreating on all fronts, and the ideology that had sustained them for years was crumbling under the weight of reality. Werner Klein's experience during the Battle of Berlin illustrated this collapse. Klein had been conscripted in 1944 at age 16, part of the final desperate mobilization that sent children into combat. His training lasted only 6 weeks before deployment to defend the German capital. Klein found himself in a city under siege, surrounded by enemy forces and cut off from supplies. The regular army had largely disintegrated, replaced by a mixture of SS troops, Hitler Youth members, and foreign volunteers fighting with increasing desperation. The final weeks were characterized by complete chaos. Orders came from multiple sources and often contradicted each other. Officers abandoned their posts, soldiers deserted in growing numbers, and units dissolved without notice. Klein described hiding in bombed buildings, scrounging for food, and avoiding both enemy forces and German military police who were executing deserters. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had been indoctrinated to believe in German superiority found themselves defending ruins against overwhelming odds. The promised wonder weapons never materialized, promised reinforcements never arrived, and the leadership they had trusted disappeared or proved incompetent. Klein witnessed the final breakdown of military discipline as soldiers looted abandoned shops, fought each other for food, and in some cases turned their weapons on their own officers. The system that had seemed so powerful and organized revealed itself to be hollow and unsustainable. Many soldiers simply walked away from their posts in the final days, removing their uniforms and attempting to blend into the civilian population. Others continued fighting until the very end, sustained by fear of capture rather than ideological conviction. When surrender finally came, Klein described feeling not defeat, but relief. The terrible system that had consumed years of his life was finally over. The end of the war forced Nazi soldiers to confront the reality of what they had participated in and who they had become. The process of denazification, Allied occupation, and gradual revelation of the full scope of Nazi crimes created a complex psychological reckoning that lasted for decades. Many former soldiers initially maintained that they had simply followed orders or been unaware of the broader context of their actions. They emphasized their role as ordinary military personnel rather than political actors, claiming they had fought for Germany rather than Nazism. But as evidence of Nazi crimes became impossible to ignore, former soldiers developed various strategies for processing their wartime experiences. Some accepted full responsibility and expressed genuine remorse. Others maintained that they had been victims of a system beyond their control. Many simply refused to discuss their wartime service at all. The psychological cost of their transformation became apparent in the post-war period. Rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems were significantly higher among former Wehrmacht soldiers than the general population. Many struggled with relationships, employment, and social integration. Some former soldiers became active in peace movements or reconciliation efforts, using their experiences to warn against the dangers of militarism and extremist ideology. Others retreated into private life and tried to forget their wartime experiences entirely. The children and grandchildren of Nazi soldiers often struggled with questions about their family history and the actions of their relatives. This intergenerational trauma affected German society for decades and continues to influence contemporary discussions about war, responsibility, and collective memory. What emerges from these accounts is not a simple story of good versus evil, but a complex picture of how ordinary individuals can be transformed by extraordinary circumstances. The Nazi military system was designed to exploit human psychology, social pressure, and institutional power to turn normal men into instruments of state violence. Understanding this process doesn't excuse the actions of Nazi soldiers or minimize the suffering they caused, but it does provide crucial insights into how societies can descend into barbarism and how individuals can lose their moral compass under extreme conditions. The story of Nazi soldiers serves as a warning about the fragility of civilization and the importance of maintaining strong moral institutions that can resist the pressures of extremism and authoritarianism. Their experiences remind us that the capacity for both good and evil exists within ordinary people, and that the systems we create and support can determine which aspects of human nature are expressed.